Surviving is an important task, and everyone has to do it. But some situations are more difficult to survive than others, like being lost out in the wilderness, stranded in the ocean, or even stuck in an active volcano or something. All of which are slightly more threatening than trying to talk to people in real life. So why don't you be grateful for the comforts you have, And enjoy these tales of people that have survived some of the most extreme circumstances in history. Angela Hernandez. In the July of 2018, Angela was driving on Highway 1 through the Big Sur in California, an area famous for the way its cliffs dramatically rise above the ocean. Suddenly, a small animal ran in front of her car. She swerved to avoid hitting it, but ended up driving off the cliff, where she tumbled down 200 feet to the shore below. She did manage to survive the fall, but with multiple injuries, including a brain hemorrhage, a collapsed lung, ruptured blood vessels in both eyes, 4 broken ribs, and 2 broken collarbones. She then managed to break through her window and swim to shore before passing out. After waking up, she started walking the shoreline to search for rescue. The funny thing about this survival story is that Angela was underneath a road that cars regularly drove on, which should have made it easy to be rescued. Unfortunately, though, the steep cliffside was too difficult to scale with her injuries, and the people driving above would be unlikely to see or take notice of her, despite her efforts to call for help, ironically leaving her stranded just a few hundred feet away from salvation. The preceding days became a routine of searching the beach for a way up or a vantage point to get attention from, collecting water runoff from the cliffs, and ending the day by sleeping somewhere above where the tide would rise to. This continued for about a week, until she was finally discovered by a couple walking down the beach. Shortly after, they got help and a rescue team arrived to take her to a hospital. And all of this happened because she didn't want to hit an animal on the road. I know it sucks, but sometimes you have no choice but to run him over. Aron Ralston. Aron Ralston's survival story is one of the most famous in all of history. In the April of 2003, Aron was on a hiking trip through Blue John Canyon in Ohio. As he was descending into the canyon, a nearby boulder dislodged and crushed his right hand, pinning him to the canyon wall. He soon realized that he was trapped and in serious trouble, as he didn't inform anyone of his hiking plans, nor did he have a phone or other way of contacting someone. At first, he tried to dislodge his arm from the rocks, experimenting with various methods of lifting or chipping away at the stone, but it was no good. His hand was seriously stuck in there and he was not able to free it. After 3 days of trying to free himself with various methods, and rationing what little food and water he had on him, he concluded that the only way to escape was to cut his own hand off. He started to carve into his arm with the blade of a cheap multi-tool that he brought, and it turned out to be surprisingly easy and painless to cut through. This was, fortunately, due to the fact that the flesh in his hand started to rot, and was mostly dead now due to the lack of circulation. He was able to tear through his own flesh, but he wasn't able to saw through the bone. After struggling a bit more, an idea came to him. He may have been unable to cut through his bone, but he might be able to break it. He used the leverage of his arm to bend and break his bone against the boulder, and after sawing through the remaining flesh, he finally freed himself of his arm, 6 days after being trapped there. But his struggles were far from over. He still needed to get out of the canyon and make it to safety, and now he was bleeding out through his arm. Despite all the odds against him, he managed to scale the canyon and stumble into a walking path, while staunching the bleeding with a makeshift tourniquet. Fortunately, a Dutch family on vacation stumbled into him as they were touring the area. One of them left to get help, and rescue would come for him shortly after. And while he may have lost his hand from the whole ordeal, he did become quite famous from it and got to make a bunch of appearances on various medias. The Tham Luang Cave Rescue. The Tham Luang Cave Rescue is a survival story about a soccer team of about 12 boys in ages ranging from 11 to 16, and their 25-year-old coach getting stuck inside a cave system. In Vietnam during 2018, a football team known as the Wild Boars ventured into the Tham Luang cave system after their football practice. The cave system was one of the largest in all of Thailand, with winding passages that stretched to over 10 kilometers. They were planning to have a birthday party for one of the boys inside, but were caught off guard by a sudden heavy rainfall. This flooded the entrance to the cave and forced them deeper inside. Soon enough, people noticed the group's absence. When they saw their bikes at the cave entrance, they suspected the worst and sounded the alarm. What would follow was a truly gigantic rescue effort that involved almost 10,000 people, including double digits of divers, rescue workers, international government agencies, police officers, soldiers, as well as 10 helicopters and 7 ambulances. The conditions for diving were also extremely difficult. So difficult that even experienced, healthy divers struggled with it, with one of them actually dying on a trip out. And if someone like that died going through, then how would a bunch of boys with no diving experience fare? On the 2nd of July, divers found the soccer team, but the logistics of getting them out of the cave proved to be extremely challenging. For the time being, teams of divers would deliver supplies to the group to keep them alive, but heavy rains were projected in the coming days, and the air pocket the team was trapped in was running out of oxygen. They were fighting against the clock to make a rescue plan. A variety of options ranging from pumping water out of the cave to drilling a new exit through were considered. They ultimately decided the most feasible option was to funnel the kids out one by one with a diver to assist each. And by assist, I mean carry them because the kids were sedated and fully unconscious by the time the diving team would rescue them. On July 8th, the weather improved and it was considered the ideal time to enact the rescue. Each boy was fitted in a wetsuit with a face mask to provide them oxygen, given a number of drugs to sedate them, and carried in a device likened to a shopping bag to make the process easier. The boys were then funneled out through a complex daisy chain of being carried, slid, and zip-lined along a complex network of pulleys. The rescue operation involved almost 100 divers from around the world, working in dangerous conditions where teams would transport each body through the cave system. The bodies had to be moved about 3 kilometers in total out of the cave in 45-minute intervals, with each taking about 2 to 3 hours of work to get out. In the end, their efforts were successful and every member of the soccer team survived. This was great news. However, it was made a bittersweet victory due to the fact that 2 of the rescue workers died in the process. So please, when entering a cave, make sure to know when it will flood before entering. Harrison Okene. Okene was a chef working on a tugboat in 2013. The tugboat was assisting an oil tanker about 20 miles off the coast of Nigeria. He was on the toilet when a sudden wave capsized the boat. He tried to get through the door to escape, but he was stopped before he could when, and I quote, "the toilet fell and hit me on the head." As he was regaining his senses, the lights went out and he was left in the dark. He made his way to the exit hatch and met 2 or 3 other sailors there trying to get the door open. But Okene didn't want to wait around, so he instead decided to swim deeper into the ship. While this action goes against most survival instincts, it's likely what ended up saving his life, as another swell of water swept up the 11 other sailors and trapped them in the ship, where they would all drown in the cold water shortly after. But Okene was pushed into another toilet, and a room where a 4-foot air bubble had formed. Taking notice of the situation he was in, Okene decided he needed to calm down and started getting to work on escaping. He started by breaking off a piece of metal from a vent and using it to open the bathroom door. Then he started on getting the exit hatch open. He had to hold his breath while working, so he swam back to get air several times as he worked. Searching through the ship, he also found a bit of food and soda to survive off of. But he needed to escape soon, because his air supply was running out. He'd been down there for almost 60 hours until a team of divers looking to recover bodies discovered the ship. He swam out and managed to get the divers' attention, who proceeded to bring him to a depressurization chamber. After his rescue, he was informed about the deaths of the rest of his crew. Harrison Okene's survival was nothing short of a miracle. If Harrison had stayed down there any longer, the CO2 concentration would have increased to critical levels and likely killed him. And if he had tried to swim straight to the surface, he also would have died. The ship had sunk 100 feet before resting on the ocean floor. And if he had swam to the surface too quickly, the depressurization would have killed him. Okene was understandably traumatized by all this, and swore to never return to the ocean, but he wouldn't end up keeping his promise. In fact, he started working as a diver just a few years later, his near-death experience having given him a new appreciation for the ocean. Personally, I don't know how that inspired him to want to work underwater, but I guess all that matters is that he's happy with it. John Franklin. In the early 19th century, just after the Napoleonic Wars, the British Royal Navy were hoping to find the Northwest Passage from the Hudson Bay in Canada. enabling faster trade through the area. An expedition team formed to find it involving John Franklin as its leader, apprentice naval officers Robert Hood and George Back, John Richardson, the doctor, field biologist and second in command, and an ordinary seaman named John Hepburn that set off in the late August of 1819. The first sign of this expedition going wrong was the bare bones budget. Franklin only brought the minimum needed personnel, and planned for the expedition's rations to be supplemented by whatever food they could hunt or trade with the locals for, making it heavily dependent on outside help. It's worth mentioning that they were traveling through the cold, barren, and mostly uncharted territory in northern Canada for what would likely be several years. Before the journey even really started, things went wrong. The Hudson Bay and Northwest companies that were supposed to provide men and supplies at York Factory for the expedition had mostly failed to do so, as the two companies were currently in a bitter fight. They refused to cooperate with each other and had few supplies to spare. No additional manpower arrived, and the boat he was provided with was too small, forcing him to leave behind a lot of equipment at the start. As they made their way from fort to fort, Franklin attempted to negotiate assistance from the locals. He was able to recruit about 16 additional men of, quote, less than ideal standards, and got a pledge from the Yellowknives tribe to leave food deposits behind for them, from the tribe's chief Okene, which he was depending on to survive the return trip. They were told many times that food was scarce this year, to the point where some families resorted to cannibalism to survive. And Franklin's group was already running low on food, but he shrugged it off. Worse yet, Back and Hood started fighting over a girl they met, and would have had a duel over it if their gunpowder hadn't been taken away. The party was already considering a mutiny over the circumstances, believing that continuing would mean certain death, and Franklin only kept them in line with threats of harsh punishment. Franklin's hopes of bolstering their food supplies through trading with the Inuit immediately failed, as they fled the moment they saw the group approaching. They pressed on, and after exploring and mapping out a disappointing amount of coastline, they were forced to turn around and start the journey back. By September 7th, 1821, they were out of food. The group resorted to mostly eating a barely edible lichen called rock tripe, and maybe a rotting carcass every now and then if they were lucky. They became so desperate that they started eating their shoe leather to survive. The party was fully rebellious at this point. They abandoned heavy gear like canoes and fishing nets against orders, and were only sticking with the group because they didn't know the way back themselves. The party had made it to Coppermine River, which meant that Fort Enterprise was close. Unfortunately, they discovered that there was no way to cross the river without boats, which they abandoned. With that, most everyone had given up, and laid down to accept their fate and perish. But one gigachad by the name of Pierre State Germain saved the whole expedition by crafting a canoe from branches and leaves. His improvised vessel worked and got the whole group across the river, but they were so weak now that many couldn't continue. Franklin decided to split the party into 3 groups, with Back and 3 other voyagers as the strongest, who would venture ahead and try to bring back supplies. Franklin with most of the other voyagers following Back's group at a slower pace, and the group too weak to move, including Hood, Richardson, and a voyager named Hepburn, waiting back at camp in hopes supplies could be brought back to them. Shortly after Franklin's group started traveling, 4 members turned back to join Hood's camp. Only one man, named Terohade, would end up returning. Meanwhile, Franklin's group had almost made it to the promised food deposit. The party may have been starving, but at least there was a large amount of meat waiting for them there was nothing there. So back when Franklin and Okene were discussing terms, Okene did the equivalent of going, "Yeah, sure man," and agreed to the arrangement with no intention of actually following through on it, expecting the group to die before they even made it back to camp anyways. Back's group discovered this when they first arrived, so they continued marching on to look for Okene's group, leaving behind a note for Franklin's party. It was October 12th and they had not eaten anything but rock tripe for 4 weeks. They were too weak to continue, so they stayed there, falling into depression and starvation. Back over in Hood's party, Terohade returned to the group, explaining that he got separated from the rest of the group and that he expected them to be there shortly. They were a little skeptical of his story, but they overlooked that when he presented them with meat that he got from hunting. He would continue bringing back this mystery meat for the group. and he started to act more secretively and erratic over time. The group began to suspect that Terohade had killed the other three voyagers he was traveling back with, and the meat he got from hunting was actually him going out to scavenge and eat from their corpses. One day, Richardson and Hepburn were out foraging when they heard a gunshot from camp. They returned to find Hood shot in the back of the head, with Terohade holding a rifle over his body. He tried to explain it away, but the two were pretty sure of what happened. However, they were both weak and starving, while Terohade was armed, and had been protein maxing from several days of eating human flesh. Reasoning they wouldn't be able to stop him, they stayed silent and avoided confronting him. Following this, Terohade would not let them out of his sight for several days, and would aggressively question them on if they thought he murdered Hood or not. After 3 days, Terohade went out to do some more hunting, and in that time, Richardson loaded his gun and shot Terohade on his return. After that little incident, they continued to Fort Enterprise to meet with Franklin, where they discovered the severity of malnutrition the party was at. They had ripped up most of the floorboards to burn for warmth, and had been eating shoe leather and rotting deer skins to survive. After another week of suffering, on November 7th, rescue finally arrived with the help of 3 of Akecho's men, bringing back food for the survivors. At that point, 11 of the 19 men had starved to death, but the remainder were able to be nursed back to health and saved. Overall, not a great expedition. Over half the team starved to death and only mapped out a small amount of coastline for it. But at the very least, Franklin became famous for being known as the man who ate his shoes to survive. So that's something, right? And that's it. Thank you all for coming, and I'll see you later.